Hello and welcome to AEW.1, the AEW Women's Division blog. My name is Travis. You can read more of our articles at AEW.1. Hit me up on Twitter at AEW_1. That's ONE. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. It makes us feel too sweet. All right, let's get into it. This is the audio version of an article we have published online on AEW.1 entitled AEW Should Sign Zoe Dubois, published February 2nd, 2024. If you'd prefer to read it, you may go there. But for the purposes of this video, there will be minimal visuals, so just treat this like a podcast. Pro wrestling isn't ballet. We should really consider retiring this saying. If anything, ballet or dance is the perfect athletic background to transfer over to pro wrestling. Zoe Dubois, aka Black Swan, didn't grow up dreaming of being a pro wrestler or even watching pro wrestling. But from the age of 2, she's now 23, Zoe has been learning choreography, how to portray a character on a stage, and tell stories non-verbally, purely through body language and pantomime to a live crowd. Along the way, she's developed incredible core strength, flexibility, and coordination. With all that being said, as a note to pro wrestling scouts, I would think about getting off the football field and checking out the nearest dance studio. And Zoe isn't a total anomaly in this respect either. You can see Ashley D'Amboise or Thekla over in Stardom. But what makes Dubois unique is that she hasn't merely salvaged a portion of everything she's learned from ballet that transfers over to pro wrestling and discarded the rest. Rather, this precocious ballerina seems hellbent on raising the level of pro wrestling up to ballet's impossible standard. Not necessarily consciously, but through her inherent intellectual curiosity. For example, in an interview with We Love Wrestling, Zoe talks about how she draws on ballet's theoretical methodology of storytelling and adapts it to wrestling. Where she was once conveying a story using sautés and grand battements, I have no idea if I pronounced those correctly, she now resorts to suplexes and neck breakers. You can tell she hasn't entirely fleshed out how this all works, but there's a reason for excitement. This ancient art form, that being ballet, with its rigorous discipline and orthodoxy, surely has a thing or two to teach its younger freewheeling distant cousin in pro wrestling about connecting with a live audience. There's so much to mine and so few conduits to do it, and Zoe just happens to be one of these conduits. So you might ask, why doesn't Zoe just continue with ballet? Well, Zoe's explanation is a bit more self-deprecating, so I'll use my own artistic license to reformulate her answer. She's been blessed with a physique more accepted in pro wrestling than ballet. In other words, the girl is a physical specimen. Ballet's loss is pro wrestling's gain. As Black Swan, Zoe never feels like a wrestler with a ballerina gimmick. Rather, she feels like a ballerina who somehow stumbled into pro wrestling. This is actually more fact than fiction. It can take wrestlers years or even decades before they nail down their character. Zoe, to the envy of 99% of pro wrestlers, has done it from day one. Everything I've listed up till now sounds great in theory, but I wouldn't have looked into this if what I was seeing in the ring wasn't extraordinary. Depending on her opponent, a Black Swan match can have varying degrees of execution and timing. Most fans, if they're familiar with Zoe's work at all, may remember her dark matches on AEW against Sky Blue and Will Nightingale. But according to Cage Match, those were just her 4th and 9th professional matches. So you'll need to seek out more recent indie work against a wider variety of proficiency in opponents on YouTube to get a better idea of where she's at. I would recommend checking out Black Swan versus Tanya from Pride Style Guilty Pleasures, And if you're a fan of intergender wrestling, I would recommend looking up her match against Damian Drake. Black Swan, as far as the fundamentals are concerned, I would say is coming along nicely. But what captures my imagination is seeing some of the extremely high-end stuff that she pulls off, along with what she does in between moves. She is a unicorn. Zoe does a lot of simple things in her own unique way. The way she stands communicates a PhD level of mastery over her own body and movement. Even a simple headlock takeover is accentuated with her own unique flair. She'll duck a grapple and then arch her back, looking at her opponent upside down while her upper body just floats like it's in water. And I marvel at the way she transports her body like Terminator's T-1000. She'll pour the lower half of her body like a liquid through the ropes and onto the apron until the rest of her body reconstitutes in place. Even Black Swan's delivery of her kicks feels like something that was built in a studio rather than a ring. And of course, there's her devastatingly beautiful pirouette kick. She has so many unique maneuvers to juke and dodge attacks. Everything just looks liquid smooth and sometimes mind-bending. Her bumping and selling is made all the more effective for the chasmic dichotomy between how fluidly she moves when on offense or evading attacks to how ragdolled and utterly broken her body is made while taking damage. In these moments, she looks perfectly out of her element and hopelessly out of her depth. Until, of course, her ballet training once again finds an escape or reversal, and someone trained in pro wrestling couldn't have anticipated such a move. The more Black Swan matches I watch, the more tools I see. For example, in a match against Christina Von Ehre, Dubois escapes a bully choke by having her legs scorpion up over her back past her head until her feet land on the mat in front of her own face. So she's shaped like an Ouroboros. Zoe then proceeds to lift her body to a standing position. If that sounds physically impossible, trust me, what you're picturing is exactly how it looked. It's a lot easier to have an aura when you're making an entrance in front of thousands of cheering fans, backed up by a giant wall of LCD screens and arena lighting, all captured in 4K. But when watching Black Swan enter to a tiny venue in front of dozens of fans, aided only by her haunting entrance music, which admittedly is a metal version of Swan Lake that will melt your face off, it's chilling. Her red eyes peering out of two black streaks across her face, her immoderate entrance gear falls off her body in stages while she effortlessly floats along her path. It's not hard to picture how this entrance would be extrapolated onto the grander stage that is All Elite Wrestling. When I picture Black Swan's entrance in full effect, it has a floor of that of Julia Hart's. And you can do a lot to change her entrance up as she evolves. There's an infinite number of musical arrangements of Swan Lake, from classical to metal to techno to dance, and they all sound awesome. And when I think of Black Swan's final form, look up Swan Lake Epic Trailer Version by Hidden Citizens, and you can get a sense of what that would sound like and imagine what that would look like. I like that Black Swan is kind of long-term story ready. Too often in AEW, they've brought in established stars who requires the spot be made for them. And that pushes acts that the company has been building up all this time down the card, if not completely off it. And it's unfortunate because what really captures your imagination as a pro wrestling fan, or at least mine, is watching these meteoric rises of wrestlers like MJF, Orange Cassidy, and Darby Allin. With Black Swan, she could realistically be slotted on the very bottom rung of the division, similar to how Orange Cassidy came into AEW. And because she's a relative unknown, AEW could really hammer home the notion that she's a ballerina who wrestles, not a wrestler with a ballerina gimmick, by downplaying her current wrestling abilities. Have Zoe show an agent all the ballet moves that she can do in and around the ring, and then collaborate with her opponents to construct a match where Black Swan can do as few wrestling moves as she can get away with. As wrestling fans, we'd watch Black Swan show flashes of brilliance. While she struggles to initiate offense, she thrills audiences by using ballet-adjacent maneuvers that we've never seen before to evade attacks and return fire with counterstrikes. Invariably, though, she'd get caught and ragdolled by her opponent to inevitable defeat. From there, maybe we tell the story of Zoe's desire to expose more people to ballet is at odds with finding success in pro wrestling. Maybe eventually she starts to give in to being more of a pro wrestler and find success. But then maybe she plateaus. So then she must go back to her roots and somehow figure out a way of blending these two styles seamlessly to be the best version of herself. It's, that's just the first thing off the top of my mind. It kind of writes itself, though. On the indies, Black Swan fancies herself a bit of a shit talker. I think it would benefit Black Swan to enter AEW essentially muted, and with a naivete about how pro wrestling actually works. But then emphasize how, even without the basics, she can do all these things in the ring that no one else can. But maintain that mystique through aloofness. Simply not knowing what a person's voice sounds like is so intriguing. Inaccessibility drives fascination, and it'll make her words feel all the more important when we finally do start to hear from her. So with that, I'd like to just pitch a creative idea for an origin story for Black Swan. Black Swan's story kind of writes itself because it's mostly true, but that doesn't mean we can't stretch the truth a little bit. So, Zoe Dubois, training since the age of 2, under the tutelage of both her parents, was a ballet prodigy. But to make it to Paris, you have to be more than just a prodigy. You must fit the mold. And without even flexing, Zoe breaks that mold. Now we get into kind of the pathos of the Black Swan character with some admittedly AEW-pilled creative fiction. With her life's dream dashed, Zoe began searching for something to fill the void. Luckily, she lived in Las Vegas, probably the most employee city in the world for someone with her talents. She decides that she's going to expand her horizons and be open to anything. And while she excels at everything she tries, nothing can really fill the void that ballet has left. On a whim, Zoe attends her very first all-elite wrestling event, Double or Nothing, in her own backyard of Paradise, Nevada. She hadn't grown up watching pro wrestling, but she was willing to give it a look. Zoe was entranced. AEW had pageantry. It had grand entrances with musical accompaniment. What fans saw as a match, Zoe saw as a pas de deux. Fans saw a leapfrog, Zoe saw a grand jeté. Fans saw a super kick, Zoe saw a penché. It was during the main event of Double or Nothing where Zoe had two epiphanies. One, when she saw the grace and elegance with which Kenny Omega moved around the ring, she knew she could do this. And two, when she saw Jon Moxley appear out of the crowd and take out Kenny Omega and Chris Jericho, Zoe knew that she didn't want to be on this side of the barricade. She needed to be in that ring. She needed to kick some ass. But she also needed to show the world the beauty of ballet. And so it goes, the birth of All Elite Wrestling had unknowingly laid the egg which would hatch into Black Swan. I did say it would be AEW pilled, didn't I? So you can let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below, or hit me up on Twitter at AW_ONE. Thanks for watching, and as always, make sure you let the women in your life know how much you appreciate them.